So now, without further ado, tonight I'm very excited to welcome Jonah Bromwich celebrating the release of Dragon on Center Street. Dragon on Center Street is a gripping, absurd, and outrageous story of power, attention, and America's future. A must-read for anyone seeking to understand this defining moment in history, and a political drama so wild, you'll have to remind yourself it's all true. Jonah Bromwich is a reporter for the New York Times, has covered Manhattan's criminal justice system for years. He was a lead reporter on Trump's criminal trial, reporting live from the courtroom for more than a month. He has covered a number of major legal stories for the Metro desk, including multiple trials involving President Trump, the downfall of Governor Andrew Cuomo, and the chaos on Rikers Island. Previously, Jonah worked for the Style section, reporting on cultural change brought about by social media and celebrity culture. Jonah will be in conversation with Michael Schmidt. Schmidt is a two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning Washington correspondent for the New York Times. Over his 20 years at the Times, he has covered the investigations of the Trump presidency, the Pentagon, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and the war in Iraq. So please join me in welcoming Jonah Bromwich and Michael Schmidt to Politics and Prose.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. We're going to start with, I'm just going to read a little bit of the book, and it's actually going to be two separate passages, but they go one after the other. And the first comes right before my team and I broke the news of Trump being indicted in Manhattan, the first ever indictment of a former president. So it's a great story, I think. It's the beginning of the book, and I'll let you buy the book and read that part. So this part that I'm going to read comes right after that. We've published the story saying that Trump has been indicted. Half an hour after we published, helicopters whipsawed the sky above Center Street. Outside the district attorney's office at 1 Hogan Place, photographers gathered in tight formation to capture an image of the first prosecutor to secure charges against Trump. Anti-Trump protesters materialized, holding small signs that said, "Trump is over." Then, working in lockstep, unfurled a large black and white banner. "The time is now." Some of Trump's notable adversaries celebrated the indictment in the media-generated version of Manhattan that was their natural habitat, the facsimile of the city that overlays and occasionally intersects with the real thing. "I have so many messages coming in that I can't respond," Stormy Daniels tweeted. "Also, don't want to spill my champagne." Michael Cohen, the disloyal fixer who turned on Trump in 2018, spontaneously released an episode of his podcast, Mea Culpa, where, in a schadenfreude deranged voice, he said the prospect of Trump being booked, fingerprinted, and mugshotted, quote, "fills me with delight." Cohen was not alone. Far more dignified enemies of Donald J. Trump considered him a disease on the body politic, and for years their ideal cure was clear: a strong dose of the law. Though Trump had been sued many times, he had never before faced prosecution and had never been charged with a crime. Reasoning that the rule of law was a force with which even he would have trouble contending, many of the president's critics awaited a champion who could vanquish him from the political scene entirely. A prosecutor, heroically nonpartisan, preferably Republican, fit the bill. There had already been a cycle of would-be dragon slayers to whom Trump's haters pinned their hopes: Robert Mueller, Jack Smith, Cyrus R. Vance Jr., and Liz Cheney. Now, to the great surprise of many, it was Alvin Bragg's turn. Bragg emerged from his office on 1 Hogan shortly after 7 p.m. The camera splashed eagerly, and in vain, as the district attorney stumbled into a black SUV surrounded by a human shield of hard-faced security personnel. The vehicle disappeared into the evening, leaving behind questions that would remain unanswered for days. A year earlier, Bragg's refusal to go forward with the Trump case was slammed as shameful and cowardly. Now he had reversed what his liberal critics believed was an unforgivable failure of justice. He stayed the course, found a case he believed in, and indicted Trump. But much of the commentariat was unmoved. They wanted Trump erased from the political map. It was unclear whether Bragg's case would suffice. "When you strike at a king, you must kill him," the saying goes, Ruth Marcus wrote in the Washington Post. Bragg is dealing with a wounded but still dangerous king. I hope he knows what he's doing. But no one outside of the DA's office knew what Bragg was doing. Inundated with requests to confirm the news reports, his team was granted special permission by a judge to acknowledge the indictment. But the charges wouldn't be revealed until the arraignment on Tuesday, The district attorney was not in the habit of offering surplus information, not when silence was such an attractive alternative. Trump would travel to New York to hear the accusations and presumably to plead not guilty. And I'll just read a little bit more from the arraignment itself. Trump entered the courtroom, and every reporter turned cautiously to look at him. At first sight, the former president emanates a kind of shockwave of recognition, the most photographed man in the world, out from behind the lens. His color, created for the camera, looks strange at close range. So does his hair, coiffed in the front but threadbare in the back, such that someone sitting behind him for weeks at a time sees a different patch of his scalp each day. His eyes are small, shark-like, constantly roving, searching the crowd. But when Trump sat down at the defense table, the jolt of his presence eased. Watching him in person for the first time, I was astonished by the way he seemed to shrink within himself. This man, who for years had been the center of attention in any room he was in, was almost extraneous here. His arraignment was the biggest story in the world, but it wasn't his show. In the criminal courtroom, the judge commands the room, and the lawyers occupy the stage. The defendant is passive. He sits quietly, unless he wants to get thrown out of court. Shortly after 2:15, the judge, Juan Merchan, a slim, gray-haired former prosecutor with steel behind his calm tone, entered the courtroom. "Let's arraign Mr. Trump," he said.
Well, that's fantastic. That's great.
Thanks, Mike.
This is really fun and wonderful to be here, especially after reading the book and getting a chance to see how much you have thrown yourself to not only live this story, but learn this story. And I think sometimes as journalists, when we do that and we really get to know something up close, we feel like we understand things about it that maybe the public doesn't understand, or we appreciate things about it that the public doesn't understand, or we see them in the arc of a story or of history in ways we don't understand. You see this and know it in a way better than anyone else. What is it that you think that we don't appreciate or don't totally know or don't totally get that you either, knowing everything you know or from reading from us reading this book should really get?
So two things, and the first is more simple and the second is more complicated. So the first is what this case was about. This is the only criminal case against Donald Trump, and yet I still think that people refer to it as the hush money case. They think it was about a payment to Stormy Daniels, and that's the end of it. And the truth is that like the legal theory or not, this case is about the corruption of the 2016 election. It's about the burying of 3 separate stories at key points during Trump's first campaign and the effect that had on the election. And so what the prosecutors proved to the jury, what Trump is convicted of, is not simply the crime of paying hush money. It's, in fact, not a crime to pay hush money. It's the crime of corrupting an election.
So what you're saying is that the 2016 victory that he has, which, a lot in the public's mind is about Russia and Russia interfering or something James Comey did, that this case is really about his clandestine efforts that actually influence what the public knew in that election.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it also brings me to my second point, which is that in the courtroom, as a court case is in many ways an act of persuasion. And so where phones are barred and where you are forced to sit there, in my case, kind of live blocking every piece of it, in the jury's case, just paying attention with no distractions, this was an act of persuasion, not only that those things had happened, but that it really mattered, that it really could have affected the election, that it was fundamental to understanding the trajectory of our country's history.
Are you saying that the guilty verdict is somehow the jury saying this mattered to the 2016 election?
Yeah, they were convinced that this had happened and that the prosecutors additionally made the case that this election was so close, individual news events were affecting it so strongly that this could very well have mattered. They didn't ever say, oh, this is it. This, like, if we prove our case, you will understand that Donald Trump would not have won the election were it not for this. But they did argue that it mattered, and the jury took that argument very seriously.
Do you think Donald Trump appreciates what you're saying, that the case is not about hush money, that it's truly about whether he won the 2016 election?
I do. I think that he understands that. There was this amazing moment during the trial because I was so caught up in the legal strategy and what the prosecution was doing, what the defense was doing. And at some point, I had been in the courtroom for all of this, obviously, and I messaged a colleague and I was like, I think Trump is guilty. Like I too had been persuaded, even though it may seem obvious now, of the prosecution's case. I was like, it really is amazing to think that he is sitting there probably having done all this stuff, his lawyers denying every piece of it, and it being so fundamental to this moment in American history.
So in a sense, what you're saying is that when people say, oh, it's the hush money case, it was the weaker of the 4 cases, it kind of puts down the severity of the case, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think one of the reasons people think that way is because the legal cases against Donald Trump were always thought about in terms of instrumentality. What can this do for me as a Trump critic politically? I think that people so opposed Trump felt so kind of strongly that he was illegitimate in some way, that everything about him kind of screamed that he shouldn't be a politician for his critics, that the legal investigations into him were a relief. And so because of that, I think often that people thought of them in terms not of necessarily of justice, but which of these has the strongest chance of removing Donald Trump from the political map.
But in a sense, this case had the chance, and ultimately does, based on what you're saying, show that perhaps his 2016 victory is not legitimate.
But only in the courtroom. That's the other thing that was really fascinating to me, and it's really the reason I wrote this book, because I found this case very compelling. I found it very interesting. I certainly didn't think it was a slam dunk in terms of the legal theory, but I thought that it was an amazing thing to go and see it presented every day in court. And then I got out of court and I realized, despite all that live blogging, that people still didn't understand it that well, that they hadn't even engaged with the case in its fullness in the way that it was presented in court. And that was really striking to me. And I already had a lot of kind of thoughts and ideas about Trump's dominance due to kind of shifts in the media environment, the rise of television, the rise of social media. And when I saw the difference between what I experienced in the courtroom and how the public more broadly was absorbing it, I thought, oh, there's a lot more to the story that people don't understand.
And you wrote in, I believe it was in the either acknowledgments or the end notes or the notes about where your sourcing came from, that you believe the trial should have been televised. Why should it have been televised? And what would have been different if it had been televised?
So I think it's incumbent upon American institutions to meet the American public where they are. So the idea that I did an interview earlier today, and I was talking about this kind of live blogging, and of course, people who were really, really interested in the trial and understood it deeply wanted that, and they went back to the well time and time again. And I think we served those people, a lot of whom are our readers, very well. But most people didn't even understand what this case was about or how it was differentiated from the other indictments or the civil cases against Trump, let alone would they, go to the New York Times, pay a subscription fee, and plonk themselves down and read a bunch of it. Americans watch television. They watch short-form video on social media. I think institutions need to meet them where they are, and particularly an event of this magnitude and of this importance absolutely should have been broadcast to as many Americans as possible. And the fact that it wasn't, I think, probably has real repercussions, but I also don't want to go too far in saying that, because one of the things that can happen on social media is that things can be clipped and edited and presented in a certain light. So I don't want to suggest, it was a deciding factor. This trial was so striking and remarkable that had only Americans seen it, then Trump would not be president again. I think that's falling into the same trap again. The point to me is not necessarily to say having become a convicted felon made Trump illegitimate, but rather people need to have access to this information if we believe it to be so important.
How do you think you would have written the book differently if Trump had lost?
Oh, I know the answer to that question.
I know what you're going to say.
What do you think I'm going to say?
I think you're probably going to say I wouldn't have written it differently.
No, that's not. No,
okay, good.
No. I had a plan because I was drafting the book and Harris was viable. So I had to think about how it might work. And one of the things that I thought Harris might do, and I thought early on she was doing, I hesitate to say a good job of, because there's a lot that I don't like about this approach. But early on, she was avoiding a lot of substance. She was talking, kind of in platitudes and aphorisms, and she was getting celebrities on her side, and she was getting celebrities involved, and she was running this campaign that was very light on substance, but really clearly energizing people. I don't know if that would have been sustainable, but what I saw from that was, she seems not hugely like Donald Trump. She's just so different in terms of her mannerisms and her disposition. But she was taking a page from his book in the sense of understanding that short, bright messaging, being here, there, and everywhere, not necessarily engaging with questions that weren't going to flatter her, was going to be a useful strategy for her. So there was a point at which I thought, oh, maybe she'll move a little closer to understanding what makes him so successful, what makes him so powerful in this 21st century. And then ultimately, I think she moved away from that, and that's one of the reasons that he really overcame her.
And do you think that part of the reason that the public struggles sometimes to understand this is that we're looking to the criminal justice system to largely answer a political question or to solve what they think is a political problem, and that you're looking, to courtrooms that are not set up to do that, but they're being asked by people to do that and ultimately providing unsatisfying results?
Yeah, 100%. I would completely agree with that. And it's been really interesting. I'm not a political reporter, so I'm out of my element to some extent when I talk about this. But it's been very interesting to watch this narrative of democratic collapse over the last 6 months. Obviously, that often happens when a Democrat loses a presidential election. But to me, that's one of the repercussions of this approach to Trump, this idea that he was illegitimate, pursuing him legally, rather than understanding, no, he's not just a scam artist. No, it's not just that Russia helped him win his first campaign. This person is speaking to something that really appeals to a lot of Americans, and it's important to both understand the means by which he's doing that and also parts of the message that are really appealing. And it's interesting now to see Democrats having that conversation after some of these kind of legal quote-unquote solutions have fallen away or have failed.
When we were first talking about the book, I said to you, how did you like writing the book? And I expected your answer to be similar to mine, which was that I wrote a book several years ago and I hated it. And because I think I really like being a daily newspaper reporter, and my guess was oh, you like being a daily, and you had a completely different answer. Why did you like writing it so much? And what did you like about it?
I became totally obsessed, not with this case, but with the people who made this case happen and animated it. Alvin Bragg, for instance, there were so many answers to the question you asked me earlier, Mike, about kind of what I think people don't understand. So another one of it is, what are the roots of Alvin Bragg? Why is he the person who brought this case? I have a kind of a front row seat, not just to Bragg, but also the media perception of Bragg as it develops, which misses the point that Bragg's predecessors as Manhattan District Attorney, they were essentially kind of members of the American aristocracy. Both their fathers were cabinet secretaries. They were people who really could decide what deserved to be prosecuted and what didn't deserve to be prosecuted. And they did it, as you might expect, from these kind of old line members of American society. Bragg is a striking contrast to that. He's the first black Manhattan District Attorney. He's someone who comes up in the midst of a progressive prosecution movement, talking about the ways in which the system has failed black people, the ways in which the system treats kind of petty crime harshly and serious crime less harshly. And he comes into office kind of riding that wave, not as the most leftist candidate in the race, as is often, I think, assumed of him now, but as a very moderate candidate in a race that had a huge amount of people running. He gets into office, he inherits a case against Trump, he doesn't bring it right away. He in fact says, I don't like this case, and he doesn't bring the case. And then he brings the case that the book is about, which has this remarkable novel legal theory, which to me, I connect with Bragg's background. And he has said to me back, way before this case was even a glint in his eye, that if the facts were there, if the evidence was there, he was always comfortable. And the novel legal theories didn't bother him as much. And I have to believe that has something to do with seeing people kind of mistreated, prosecuted for crimes that were not.
Explain to us the novel legal theory part of this, because that's an important part of understanding it.
Sure. So this case is kind of like a triple layer cake or a Russian nesting doll. It's incredibly complicated to explain. But there are two parts that are fundamental to understand. Trump was accused of falsifying business records, 34 counts of falsifying business records, and those charges are related to the one hush money payment to Stormy Daniels. But underlying that first charge is a state election crime charge, which accuses him of conspiring, in this case with David Pecker and Michael Cohen, to promote himself by unlawful means during the 2016 election. And the unlawful means are the third layer. It's all this kind of petty fraud and criminality they committed along the way as they were seeking to bury these three stories. And so the aspect that had to do with the election in the courtroom was by far the kind of most stunning and most interesting, and really, I think, won the jury over. And then the falsifying business records part of the case, ostensibly the top charge, the thing that really mattered, but the jury didn't necessarily know that, was like 2 days of paperwork cruised by in a blink of an eye, and we never really kind of dwelt on it. And so the way this case was wrapped together, I think, was really derided by a lot of people. I don't think they were wrong. I think it was an incredibly daring thing to do, and maybe kind of silly thing to do, to bring such a kind of jerry-rigged, you might say, case against the former president. At the same time, Bragg believed that this was a crime. He found legal statutes that fit that kind of conception of this behavior as criminal, and he brought a case, and the jury convicted, and judges kind of blessed the case.
But how risky do you think that was? So obviously, like in hindsight, it doesn't look very risky because it turned out,
Oh, no, it's still risky. I mean, I think the appeals of this case are going to be really, really compelling. And there are really serious issues in terms of how the legal theory operates that could come up.
So what you're saying is that because of the unique nature of the legal structure of the case, and the fact that even though we may think it's gone in our heads, it's still being appealed today. The president is still fighting it, even though he's never going to be sentenced.
Yeah.
In it. And the novelty of it could come back to haunt it still.
100%. Yeah. And one of the things that I'm excited about, just because I'm so obsessed with this case, is I don't think that Donald Trump's defense lawyers did a fantastic job defending this case. And I do think it was defensible. I'm not amongst those people who believe, oh, Manhattan jury, automatic conviction for Donald Trump. I believe that the jurors took their oaths seriously.
But to the point of that, and you hit on this in the book, isn't part of the defense maintaining sort of a lot of his public posture so he can continue to be the candidate he is as he wins re-election?
Yes.
Isn't it? So it's like all tied together.
100%. And one of the things that you have to, I think, give them credit for is they understood that for Trump, the political is paramount. And to have news come out of the courtroom that, in fact, he conceded that he had slept with Stormy Daniels after denying it for so many years, or that he had even engaged in this kind of conspiracy, which, again, they could have completely conceded that he paid all this hush money and still not have been in that much trouble. And in fact, I think it really would have helped them in terms of that criminal case.
Because the book reflects this sort of where if you were just trying to get acquitted, and you were trying to do everything to get acquitted, and you didn't care about anything else, the lawyers, his defense lawyers, would have run a different case. But they ran a case that basically at times they were saying, no, the sky is purple, or the sky is a different color than it is.
Yeah.
Objectively taking on facts that are like, they're saying largely things that are false, or things that are not true, or that you wouldn't say typically as a defense lawyer.
I mean, I'm under the impression that they believed they could do both, that they thought they could maintain the Trump's narrative around these events and also defend the case well. Todd Blanche has definitely told Trump that he believed a hung jury was possible. And I believe, and I say in the book, that I think Todd Blanche genuinely thought this case was ridiculous, should never have been brought. But they never seem to settle on a defense strategy. So as I've said, I kind of divide this case into the falsifying business records charge and then the state election crime. All they would have had to do was to disprove or convince the jury that there was reasonable doubt that Trump had been involved in the scheme to falsify business records. And that, unlike the state election crime, which had so much evidence that was so hard to deny, that rested on testimony from Michael Cohen, just these two conversations that he had with Trump. One of them, he was alone with Trump. The other, Alan Weisselberg, was there, and Alan Weisselberg was never going to testify. That was Michael Cohen's testimony. And so I think that if the defense lawyers had locked into that and ignored huge amounts of the case, they had a really good chance to convince this jury that they should have reasonable doubt about what Michael Cohen said about those conversations, and thus that Trump actually was guilty of falsifying business records.
You seem to have as you've said, like an obsessive nature about the case, right? Like you have poured yourself into this. Is this an example of like a reporter who had a really unique opportunity to be the lead guy on a really important thing, and you just gave it everything you had, or you found this case really interesting and it happened to line up with the assignment that you were given? Or there's, when you have a story, ever since you were a kid, you were obsessed with, I don't know, hush money trial. I know it's not a hush money trial. Like, where does this come from? Where inside of you does this interest come from, this voraciousness about it?
I'm really interested in people, and I think I'm particularly interested in people who work within institutions and the way that the year 2025, basically the years 2015 through 2025, have challenged those people. They're people I know very well. They're people who I am one. I am an institutionalist. I work for the New York Times, great institution that I think is struggling with a lot of these same issues. And so I think my passion for the case comes from understanding Alvin Bragg, some of the prosecutors who work under him, Juan Merchan, and seeing them grapple with these really difficult problems and sometimes get it right or be courageous and get it wrong, and sometimes just really get it wrong.
Who do you think got it right more than others, and who do you think got it wrong more than others? And I think you can make that assessment. Like, I kind of look at it like you're sitting in the press box of this, you're watching this fight go on, so you can say like, well, I think this person was more effective than this person without, expressing an opinion on it.
Sure, yeah. Well, during the trial itself, the prosecution did, I think, a really amazing job, much better than people expected because the case had been derided in the way it had. I think people didn't necessarily understand, it's the legal theory that people believe to be the weak part of this case rather than the evidence itself. And so the trial was just stunning. I mean, you have Donald Trump coming into this extremely grimy Art Deco courthouse every day, just like filthy, disgusting, and he sits down, and it's not the Trump that you always seen because he doesn't sit down or stand up and immediately start talking. The attention in the room kind of focuses on him briefly when he first comes in every day, but then he's not doing very much, so it leaves him and it focuses on the lawyer's arguments. And the prosecutors, particularly in the early part of the case, when they were talking about the election conspiracy, bring in witness after witness, some of whom are former allies of Trump, some of whom are his adversaries, and they basically just talk a bunch of shit about Trump 12 feet away from him while he can do nothing but kind of sit there, often with his eyes closed, I think for fear of having an outburst. So the prosecution, I think, during this case did a very impressive job when it comes to the legal strategy. Now, my kind of big belief about this case, as I've already expressed, is that people just really didn't understand it very well. And to that point, I think that Alvin Bragg owed the public more of an explanation of the case before.
Because Bragg kind of seems to kind of run a little bit from the cameras in a sense.
Bragg has not talked about the case in public. He did a news conference after the conviction, pretty standard news conference. It was totally fine. And then he hasn't talked about the case since. And his campaign, he's running for re-election. They did
mention it, right?
They did internal poll. They polled a bunch of people about what they liked about Bragg. They didn't mention Trump. I mean, it was just unbelievable. So yeah, he is really.
So you're saying that you believe the public would benefit if, like, he were to sit down and explain to the public the importance of this and lay it out in a way that's not just, the initial press conference he gives when he indicts.
Yeah, I think it's part of his job. I think it's part of all our jobs, not just to do work and just hope people will notice, because it used to be that prosecution wasn't important enough to merit understanding on its own terms, or journalism wasn't important enough to merit understanding on its own terms. But explain what it is we do, why it is we do it. Explain kind of why people have common misconceptions about, how these things happen. That's why the first chapter is about how we got the scoop on the indictment, because I think people just expect, they just get handed this information.
So you think there should be more explanation to the public about why law enforcement is doing what they're doing?
I think it should be kind of with the difficulties of doing so in mind, and not wanting to prejudice people or kind of unnecessarily inflict harm upon defendants or witnesses. Yes, I think people should be talking much more generally about the work that they're doing. The genius of Trump is that he talks about all this work.
Ask James Comey how that went.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's the other side of it.
Right,
though.
totally.
It's like, there's widely criticized for going out and providing a lengthy explanation for a decision.
Right. No, I think these are incredibly difficult things, and it's easier when you don't have to follow through. It's very hard to do, I think, the work that these institutions require of us, to be as fair as possible, as objective as possible, to be honest in this kind of fundamental way that an investigation requires, or kind of a long journalistic investigation requires, and at the same time talk about what we do and why it matters.
Do you think we as journalists need to be more robust in our public explanation for what we do?
Yeah, like a lot. Yeah, I think people are really don't understand what we do anymore, and that's why faith in what we do is dropping in the same way that faith in what judges do is dropping, faith in what prosecutors do is dropping. I think all these institutions are it's not just that they're under assault, although that's obviously part of it. It's also that we have just not kept up with how much things have changed in terms of how people consume information, in terms of how people live their lives.
How would that look? What would that potentially look like? How would that look differently for art, for us?
Like for us, for instance, the Daily is a step in the right direction, right? Like Michael does a great job of kind of talking to journalists about how they do their stories, and they talk through their stories, and the journalists come across as people. The thing that excited me about this case, and the reason that I have a genuine interest in it and kind of believe in the good faith of various parties involved, is because I was able to see them as people, as individuals. Again, the way to kind of get access to people as individuals is for them to be on camera, for them to be talking to the public, for them to be accessible in a way that institutionalists just assumed a long time ago, back when American aristocrats were more in control of everything. They didn't need to do. They didn't need to do because the people who needed to understand these things would understand them because they would read.
Let's talk about one person, not a law enforcement person at all, who ended up having to explain a lot in this case, and someone who I think you found as a witness to be particularly compelling, and someone that we as a public don't know as well as Michael Cohen, and that's Pecker.
Yeah.
And you seem to really enjoy writing about Pecker and explaining who he was and what his story was. Putting aside what he means to the legal case, explain to us the world that he brings us into and what it shows about American media and Donald Trump and the 2016 campaign.
David Pecker's biography is fascinating, really fascinating, and there's a little slice of it in the book just to kind of get you up to speed with not just who he is, but where he and Donald Trump intersect and start to do business together in a way that is kind of symbiotic for both of them. So Pecker is not an editorial guy, he's an accountant. He's a hardworking, Bronx-born accountant, and he's good at it, and he starts making money from kind of doing sums and figures very, very early on, I think while he's still in high school. He goes over to the magazine division of CBS, still doing accounting, and all these, it's the 80s, all these business transactions are like swirling around. So there's the company goes independent and then it gets bought, et cetera. And at the end of all of that, Pecker is on top of the company, not because he has kind of editorial sensibility to run a magazine, but because he's good at making money, and that has become more and more important. And so what Pecker does is very similar, in fact, to what Donald Trump does. He stuffs his magazines full of ads. He doesn't care too much about editorial content, but the thing that he understands really clearly, and he actually said this during the trial, is that what's on the cover of a magazine is the single most important element. And so he understands really early on, this is now the 90s, just how much things are trending, maybe toward the superficial, if you want to say it that way, or toward the image-based. But people are consuming information in a way and understanding things more visually than they had before that point. And I think that's a really important turning point because, of course, then once David Pecker and Donald Trump are in business together and the one starts promoting the other in his magazines.
Explain how they get into business together.
So Trump at this time he had been kind of a real estate magnate, but that wasn't, as I'm sure most people in this room know, a particularly successful line of work for him, and he really had survived on bluster, and he was running out of time to some extent. And so in the mid-'90s, after he really faces bankruptcy and near collapse is one of his first great comebacks, he switches his modus operandi, and instead of real estate, he starts promoting Trump as a brand, as an image, and as a celebrity. And David Pecker helps him to do that. And certainly once Trump starts hosting The Apprentice, which is another remarkable comeback story that's been told elsewhere, he becomes useful to Pecker because he has all this information from the celebrity world. So the two do each other favors back and forth over the course of about 15 years. And then when Trump decides he's going to run for president, nothing changes. He's still doing favors for David Pecker and vice versa in exactly the same way. And so one of the things we saw in the courtroom, one of the things I describe in the book, is this absolutely slapdash, kind of ridiculous approach to a presidential campaign that worked because things were so turbulent, because times had changed so much between kind of back when we would have thought it was all ridiculous for Trump to run for president and 2016, where he had a really viable shot.
And explain about the way that Pecker basically was able to the catch and kill stuff, and how that plays into Trump's campaign, and it plays into the larger argument about what it means to the 2016 election.
Sure. So in August 2015, David Pecker meets with Michael Cohen and Donald Trump at Trump Tower, and they have this conversation. This is so fascinating because this is what is posited as not just criminal, but the beginning of a criminal conspiracy by Alvin Bragg and his prosecutors. They have a conversation, and David Pecker agrees that he's going to promote Trump in his magazines, National Enquirer and others. He's going to denigrate his opponents, both Republicans and Hillary Clinton. And most importantly, he is going to identify particularly damaging stories which involve sex. He said that specifically in the meeting, and he is going to pay to have them buried. And he does that not once, not twice, but 3 times, and 3 times spread out over the course of the campaign, when these stories could have hurt Trump in very particular ways. So it's not just kind of one payment at the end of the campaign. It's these stories that could have kind of really shaped people's view of Trump back when he wasn't completely solidified in people's minds as he is today. He was certainly nationally known, but not a known commodity in the same way he is today.
Do you think if someone like Harris was able to, at one of the debates, get up there and say, look, there was this trial, and it showed these ways that Donald Trump and his orbit were able to impact the 2016 election in the way that they were, and she was able to do it in a clear and concise way, do you think it would have had an impact on the public?
It's a tough question. It's like a tough counterfactual.
I think your sense is like you basically look at this thing, you're like, hello, public, this is a lot more significant than you even think. And it means a lot more than just about criminality. It means something about an election. And if someone was able to have said that to the American public in a short and digestible way, which is not an easy thing to say, right? Like, it's like there's a lot to unpack. Do you think it would have mattered?
I have a way to answer your question that doesn't cause me to go quite out on a limb in the same way, which is I do think it's possible to change public opinion. And I think people have gotten really bad at it because persuasion is harder. We're very polarized. Everything else I would say would be just a cliche, so et cetera, et cetera. But I do think persuasion is possible. And I think it takes short, repetitive sentences. There's a reason that Donald Trump came up at the same time as Bernie Sanders. I think Sanders, I think, drove some people crazy because he would just say the same thing in every environment, and yet I think that's one of the reasons he was popular in 2016, and he's still popular today. I think that had Harris done what you said, I don't know that it would have made a difference overall in the election, but I'm sure more people would have understood this case, maybe understood and believed in its significance, and take from that what you will.
If I, given your interest in this case, all that you know about it, if I gave you all the powers in the world, right, the power to read people's minds, the power of subpoena, the power to get anyone to answer any of your questions, and I said you have like 3 things you could find out about this case or the people involved that you just, you still want to know the answer to.
Yeah.
What are those things?
Okay, so the first is I would love to talk to the jurors. This has been a remarkably silent jury. It is so frustrating for me personally.
I saw that in the book.
Yeah.
It's like you keep going.
Yeah, and it's something that you've been working hard on, have not stopped working hard on, but just have not been able to break through in a way. And I think that their experience is really important and could also kind of help people to understand because they were in the courtroom in the same way that I was.
Do you think that it's because of the way that Trump has publicly attacked the judge? And I mean, why do you think it's so hard?
I think that they are aligned. I think that I believe that they have a group chat. So I think they talk to each other. And I would love to be invited to their group chat. I think that they are terrified. Yeah, and I think you have to look at Alvin Bragg's reluctance to talk about this case, Mershon's.
So like out of the jurors, like you've got nothing.
There's been nothing. I mean, it's not just me. It's not just me who's failed. It's everyone. So that's one thing. The other thing is, and this is really relevant, I think, to everything we're seeing in Trump too, is Trump's lawyers pursued a strategy that hewed so close to what Donald Trump himself would want. They appealed things with utter shamelessness that never would have been appealed before. And I think you have to give them some credit. And lawyers who are facing them have to understand that these folks are going to appeal kind of ticky-tack things they would think that normally wouldn't be brought up because it's not something it's just not done to question that part of what we're talking about. And yet they do that, and they do it successfully, and then judges, I think, have no choice but to take those legal issues seriously. I would love to understand what Trump's lawyers believe about that strategy, whether they understand it to be a game or just how much true believerdom there is there.
Do you think that Todd Blanche thought he was auditioning to be Deputy Attorney General, or just trying to satisfy like a difficult client?
I think Todd Blanche is an ambitious man who understood that were he to succeed, not just in this case, but in the federal cases, in which he did in large part succeed, there would probably be something good for him along the way.
And do you think that's why he did it, or that why do you think he was attracted to representing Trump? Because Trump struggles to find elite lawyers to represent him.
Yeah.
And in Blanche, he appears to find one for the sake of, you know.
So another utterly kind of fascinating character in all this. So Todd Blanche and Emil Bove, for what it's worth, their backgrounds are very much like Trump voter backgrounds. It would not be surprising if I were to tell you everything about them, other than that they were Southern District prosecutors and what their careers looked like.
So you're saying that these are people that come from families or backgrounds that would be potential Trump voters, but went on to live lives of basically prosecutors.
That's right.
And elite white-collar defense lawyers that are making hundreds of thousands, if not more.
And I think initially when Blanche was not opposed to Trump. He did not find Trump to be deeply offensive in a kind of standalone way. One thing that he said before is that he talks about no one having any issue with Jeffrey Epstein having a lawyer, no one having any issue with Harvey Weinstein having a lawyer. So I think he was fundamentally offended early on by this idea that Trump should not have a lawyer, and a good kind of white-collar lawyer with the background that he had. He didn't understand why that distinction was made, in part, I think, because of his own politics, in part just because of his disposition. And so he started representing Trump. And one of the things that happens between Todd Blanche and Donald Trump, and you see it in court, and you see it very early on, is they like each other. They just like each other a lot. I had seen Trump with other lawyers who were kind of a little, either his peers or older than him, or actually kind of liberal, but were doing their utmost to defend him. I had never seen anyone talk to Donald Trump with the kind of excitement and enthusiasm that Todd Blanche did. And in the courtroom, it was like this remarkable thing. This courtroom artist who I read about in the book drew this portrait early in the trial of Todd Blanche and Donald Trump intertwined. And it was exactly right. He was physically incredibly uncomfortably close to him, whispering in his ear in a way that I found just like totally bizarre, honestly. But also legally, he hewed very closely to what I think made most sense for Trump. And I always wondered, is he doing this with his teeth gritted? Does he believe that this can work? Does he believe that politics is paramount, as Trump does?
I would really like to know what how Todd Blanche saw all this.
Yeah.
And how he went about it and why he went about it the way he did.
My theory, my somewhat knowledge, I have some knowledge of this, and my theory about these guys more generally is that they are more true believers than you might expect. It's not just that whole thing is a farce to them and a game to them. There are elements of that. I don't want to suggest that they're also always acting in good faith. I think that would be preposterous. But the way that kind of good faith and true belief in what they're doing in a given moment legally kind of collides with the politics and the power games of Trump world is fascinating to me. And I think it's a really fascinating human story, incredibly difficult to tell for obvious reasons, but that's something that I find really compelling.
And there was a third thing that you wanted to know, I think.
Oh yeah, what else do I want to know? I want to know how this case will be remembered, because one of the things that I saw when I was writing the book was that the Manhattan District Attorney had brought a case against a guy named Daniel Penny, who up in New York applied a chokehold to a homeless man named Jordan Neely, and the chokehold killed him. So Daniel Penny was put on trial, and about the same time, Luigi Mangione was arrested and detained. And in both those cases, we saw just an unbelievable outpouring of support for Mangione amongst young people, I think in particular, but people all over the spectrum in a way that I know really shocked a lot of people in the establishment, people who I'm close to. And for Daniel Penny, particularly among the right, he was invited to the Army. This is a guy who killed a man, whether or not it was manslaughter or not, he was acquitted, but was invited to the Army-Navy game to sit with J.D. Vance, was hired to Anderson Horowitz, was celebrated in these ways. And I saw that as the natural sequel to the trial and kind of what it had done to people's belief in the justice system, whether they were liberal and believed that the law should have held Trump to account and were disappointed that Merchan didn't end up sentencing him, or whether they were conservative and believed that this whole thing was lawfare bullshit from the get-go. So I thought that the sequel and what we're seeing now, I mean, not even to mention what we're seeing now in terms of how the rule of law is being manipulated and used by DOJ, I think this trial will mark an inflection point. And it's hard, it's easy to say that now, and it's worth reading my book to understand why that is. But I'm really, really curious to see how that plays out over the next decade.
And after writing the book and going back to being a reporter, what skills do you think you learned from writing the book that have made you a better reporter, a better storyteller, or maybe not, or maybe opened your eyes and said, I'd love to write a book again about, given this experience, I'd want to write about something else. Like, how has it changed your view of your craft, of what you do?
Yeah. The whole experience of reporting on this case made me a better reporter, and that's in part because I had this incredible mentorship from Ben Protest and Willie Rashbaum and Maggie Haberman and other people. So as I was learning about Alvin Bragg and the Manhattan District Attorney's Office and prosecution more generally, I was also learning how to report in a way that I never had. The thing that I want to do now that I think is extremely hard to do, and what I tried to do in the book, is not to just follow the news of the day, which I think so often these days involves chasing Trump, chasing the dragon, as he kind of creates this cloud of news energy, but to contextualize and help people understand this moment in a way that is so difficult to do right now. And so what I've been trying to do, I've been covering a lot of my remit now is kind of political interference in federal law enforcement in New York. Kind of how is the administration manipulating, in some cases, influencing in others, the way that law enforcement works there. And so I've been covering the Mahmoud Khalil case. I've been covering this investigation into Tish James. And I've been trying to figure out, how can I explain to our readers, not just do these as if I were doing the beats of any deportation case, any investigation, but really, what is happening here? How much is there to it, and how should they understand it as part of an overall kind of current where things are really falling apart, where things are not as solid and stable as they once were. And I think it requires of all of us like an incredible reinvention of what we do.
What do you mean things are not as solid or stable?
We were talking about this in the green room before, right? We were talking about the ways in which reporters will talk about an investigation being opened or a grand jury investigation, and how those are in some ways imprecise, but in the past have been meaningful kind of steps, and they actually mean something to our readers. And I think that the meaning of those things, given who operates the power now, who has the power now, is shifting. And we need to both understand prosecution still to be a really serious thing. I think to take criminal conduct seriously, no matter who is lobbying the accusations, and at the same time understand the way that prosecutorial power and other kinds of power can be used, and to step back and explain to readers where it matters and where it's serious, and where maybe they should be more skeptical and have their doubts.
Are there any questions?
So you were talking about how these cases, the criminal cases, and this is really for both of you, aren't a substitute for a political solution to, if you're a critic of Trump, that this is a political problem and they're bringing these legal solutions to bear. But I guess my question is, what would you have people like Alvin Bragg or Fani Willis, for all her faults, or Jack Schmidt, would you have them not pursue these cases because they don't solve that political problem?
So this is a great question. Thank you for asking it. And I think there's this amazing thing that I kind of realized as I was reporting these cases. This was the time when I think Trump had already been indicted 4 times, and we were trying to figure out how much communication the offices were having with the special prosecutor's office, Bragg's office, Fani Willis's office, just in terms of getting their calendars sorted. And what we realized is almost none. They were not talking to each other. There was no air traffic controller handling kind of this immense stuff. And so I don't understand why they couldn't have said something like that, why that kind of information, there is no coordination between us, couldn't have been made public. So I think that often critics of Trump wanted the law to operate in a way that prosecutors don't actually see it operating. I think prosecutors have a much better understanding of what it is that they're supposed to do and not supposed to do. But I would like to see folks who are prosecutors and really do what they can to kind of think through how they can convey to the public their mission. So another example I believe, and there's so many prosecutors and former prosecutors in the room that you all can correct me if I'm wrong, one of the reasons that criminal conduct is investigated from people who are very high up, kind of big fish, is because of the deterrent effect, right? Like that's one of the reasons to go after crime committed by mayors, governors, former presidents, is because those people should be understood not to be above the law. Again, that is something that Alvin Bragg, I never heard him talk about deterrent effect or how his case did not. They don't engage in a way, and not just Bragg, but prosecutors across the board don't engage with the conversations that are being had about them. And I understand both that it's untraditional. I understand why there are concerns about them doing so. I think the Comey example is a good one. But at the same time, I think that this moment really calls at least for a very careful rethinking of what can be said and not said in public.
I'm curious if you, as you wrote about this, given that it's only a year after the conviction came down, right? And that seems in many ways 17 years ago, right? And so as you race to get this out in a timely way, did you think about making this a timely bombshell type of book, and what trade-offs that was of being a timeless kind of account of this first time ever prosecution of a former president?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I thought about it a lot. I'm someone who's read a lot of, I read a lot of novels. I read a lot of stuff that I think moves very quickly and has kind of, the point of it is to be compelling and really grip people. And I've read a lot of nonfiction that I don't quite like as much, because I see the way that the book becomes almost marketing for itself and is constructed in such a way as to kind of highlight what's new in it, so that then when the book goes on sale, what's new can be highlighted and excerpted in this very easy fashion. And I didn't want to do that. I say this, I think in the notes, but the watchword of the Trump era has been incoherence. And so what I wanted to do is tell an incredibly coherent story to really make sure that people could understand it, that it was a gripping read, that it was a fast read. And I'm very proud. There's tons of new reporting in here about the prosecution. We go inside some of their conversations in a way that's never been reported. There's all kinds of characters from the trial whose pasts are illuminated with new information about that. But I really made a conscious choice not to kind of take a piece of new reporting and build structure under it to bolster it, and thus to kind of sell the book through reporting, but rather to make this something that could survive and make sense to people and be read by people who wouldn't normally read a book like this.
Maybe it's in the front of my mind because I was just reading it today, this part of it on the way down. But in the end notes, I think you say that there's a mistake or something really important that's not captured in the transcript.
Oh yeah,
and like I was like, what? Explain that.
Yeah, so it's not something really important. It's a momentary thing. But Hope Hicks, and there's a lot of these actually. Court reporters are very good, and I really relied on them to do the story. So this is no criticism of them. It's an incredibly hard job, particularly in this environment. But one of the nice things about having so many live blogs of this trial is that you had like 6 or 7 different reports of what was said in any given moment. And so there were things that were missing from the transcript. Hope Hicks getting onto the stand and saying, I'm really nervous. Little bits and pieces of Pecker's testimony that were not captured by the transcripts, or they're not even in the official record of the trial. And luckily, there was so much reporting. I mean, unfortunately, it's all in this like kind of horrible live blogs that are impossible to search out online. But if you write a book about it, you figure out how to do that, and you see, oh my gosh, not my recollection, my notes aren't wrong. In fact, a bunch of other outlets have this, even though the transcript doesn't. So, in many ways, this book is not better than the full transcript, but in some ways, it definitely is.
At what point do you think the judge made the decision he was not going to sentence Trump? And does the jury feel deflated or cheated for not having had justice meted out in the end?
So I can't answer that question and know that I'm exactly right, but there's this moment in September, and this is in the book. It's really fascinating. So the sentencing gets postponed once already. It was ultimately postponed 3 times, and then finally it ended up happening in January. There's this moment in September where Alvin Bragg and the prosecutors, the defense has pushed to delay it till after the election. And this is really interestingly, kind of where they're starting to show some of the rhetoric that's so familiar now in Trump too, which is that they're calling it election interference. They're saying it would be absolutely preposterous to hold the sentencing, which is just frankly untrue, as speedy sentencing is actually a very important legal principle in September. So the defense makes this motion, and Alvin Bragg and his prosecutors, rather than fiercely arguing against it and saying, no, this is the right thing to do to have this sentencing, this is September, they say, well, whatever you want, Judge. And I remember Marshawn is, I don't want to say clearly taken aback, because I'm gauging this from what he writes afterwards, but he writes this interesting, somewhat discombobulated, very defensive opinion where he says that left to his, because he is alone, because the other party is not pushing to have the sentencing, he cannot hold the sentencing in September. And he says, I can't remember the quote offhand, it's toward the end of the book, but he says this amazing thing as he pushes it past the election and really past the point of no return. He says, the court is an apolitical institution and should be understood that way. And he's, and is very defensive. And it's just a great example, I think. I have a line early in the book about the way that Trump forces people to kind of contort themselves in response to him. And this to me is a great example of the judge kind of contorting himself and really responding to the accusation that this was a political process.
And if Trump had lost, what do you think the judge would have sentenced him to?
So we did an analysis of this. I think that he would have received prison time. Now, I don't think he would have gone to MDC, to a lockup, but between the fact that about a third of defendants who are sentenced to this charge, or who are convicted of this charge, receive jail time or prison time, and the fact that Trump's behavior during the trial was so outrageous, and all these gag order violations, the folks that he brought into the courtroom, I really do believe that he probably would have kind of been confined for some length of time. Not a very long time necessarily, but
how long?
6 months to a year.
But doesn't that prove the critics who say that he's above the law then? Like, if you're saying to me that if he had lost, that he would have been sentenced to a significant amount of time, but he won, so he wasn't sentenced, doesn't that prove that he's above the law?
No. The phrase above the law is such a strange phrase, right? It like posits the law like as a certain line, and then someone can be kind of floating free above it. Trump is like a rhinoceros, and he shoved the law. Like it's more like he's to the side of it, changing how it functions in a way that is totally different from how it used to be. And so the idea, it's just like it's the wrong kind of analogy for how he functions.
But explain that.
In relation
what do you
to the
mean
law.
by Trump?
He has transformed. So the period that we live in, the technology, the communications, everything about this kind of cultural moment shapes the conditions for Donald Trump, right? I don't think he's successful without the media environment we have. I don't think he's successful without the celebrity obsessions, another part of the book that we have, which is related to our media environment. And so he comes along and is empowered by those things. And then he starts to wreak havoc on the rule of law because of his media savvy, because of the way he is able to make arguments to his base, which is not a majority of the country, but is a significant minority, as to why these things work. And I think, as I was talking about before, he starts to persuade people that something is not right. And one of the things that's so fascinating here, and in a sense tragic, is on the other side is Alvin Bragg also arguing there's something wrong with the way that prosecution is carried out in this country. It is unfair. It is racist. And I think kind of if you think about people's belief in the rule of law, one of the reasons that across the board you see doubts about it is because of the way those two events coincide. Criticism from the right, often led by Donald Trump, and criticism from the left, led by progressive prosecutors. And that doesn't mean that the left was wrong to criticize how prosecution worked. It doesn't mean that Donald Trump was wrong to state the case for what he believed was the truth. But I do think those things have really contributed to what we see now.
One more question.
I have the microphone, so I'm going to ask it. You've been talking a lot about institutional legitimacy. You gave some examples about how the media could perhaps regain its legitimacy with the American public. What do you think it's going to take for the judicial system to regain that sense of awe and respect that the American public used to hold I think, for the court and for the judicial system. And today it just feels like it's purely politicized and not nearly as honest as it used to be. What's it going to take for the judicial system to kind of regain its stature?
Yeah, a good question. Well, one thing I would say is that one of the reasons I think that this trial was taken seriously by people who were there in the courtroom is because those kind of signifiers of courtroom hood really matter when you're there in person. You see the judge in his robe, you see the jury in the box, you see the way that things operate according to this kind of familiar structure that I think confers legitimacy in a way that we often ignore. And so when you read about it, it all is easy to paint as crooked and corrupt. When you're there in person, it's a lot less so. So one thing that I think is honestly something that is an easy fix is like get cameras into these places, like let people see how these things operate. And one thing I think that people would see, because I've been covering Mahmoud Khalil's hearing, I have been sitting in a lot of immigration court hearings, right? And those are things that are really not open to the public at all. And you see the way, in this particular case, I don't want to speak to the skill of all DHS lawyers. I'm sure there's very good lawyers out there. But the guy that DHS has doing this case, he's barely doing anything. And Khalil's lawyers are poking holes in the evidence left and right. And the fact that this is a very prominent case, right? It's getting a lot of attention. We get a lot of readers on these stories. And yet no one has any access to what's going on inside this immigration court. And I think if people were to see courts in which things are maybe not running in the way they would like to run, and conversely, courts in which things are running and the judges are hearing people out and these kind of persuasive arguments are being made back and forth, it would make a big difference. And so there's a lot of answers to your question, but the first part is simple, like get these things to the American people.
Well, thank you very much, and it's been phenomenal to watch you cover this trial and write this book. And as I was reading the book, listening to you tonight, you're clearly the example of everything we could ever hope to have in a reporter. Someone who dives into something and tells it in an unbiased way. So, thank you.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.